It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kristopher Nielsen, who is a clinical psychologist based in Wellington, New Zealand. So Dr. Nielsen did his PhD at Victoria University, I understand, and that was in applying the 3E framework, so embodied, embedded, and enactive cognition as a framework for understanding psychopathology. And it's that PhD thesis that he's going to be summarizing today for us. And obviously, more recently, Dr. Nielsen's also published more broadly, kind of developing these views further. And so hopefully that will give us a bit of scope to kind of touch on that as well. So yeah, well, once again, thank you very much, and I'll let you take it away.
No worries. Thanks, Chris, for inviting me to do this. It's really cool to be able, pardon me, to be able to share this and have people interested in my work. If I share this, can I just check with you that you guys can see my screen?
I think we will be able to shortly. It says you've started sharing screen, but I can't actually see anything yet.
Just some lag issues.
Yeah, that's worked,
from down here in New Zealand, probably. Is it coming up there now?
That's perfect, Chris. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So yeah, thank you very much for letting me present these ideas today. As you mentioned, this is a sort of summary of some of the key points of my PhD thesis work. And this is the first time that I've tried to pull these all together into a single talk. I don't cover everything, but I've tried to cram quite a bit in there. So we'll see how we go. I think I can keep it to 45 minutes. And I just wanted to acknowledge that in case I end up rushing at any point. Sorry, my slides aren't changing over. There we go. I've changed that arrow there and it's showing up. So before getting started, I just wanted to sort of orient you to where I see my work as sitting. If we break down the sciences of psychopathology into these three main tasks of classification, explanation, and treatment, as a sort of rough and ready model of what everyone is doing research-wise, I think it's important to acknowledge that how we think about mental disorder, how we conceptualize it to begin with, much of what's going on within philosophy of psychiatry, implicitly a lot of the time, but implicitly or explicitly, is going to influence how we go about these later three tasks. So, ooh, got a bit of a lag there. So yes, I see myself as sort of rooted in a sort of conceptualization task, and with the goal of, as my research goes on, sort of starting to move into these later tasks. I also wanted to flag, before getting started, I'm aware that when I get talking about these ideas, sometimes I might come across as somewhat of a zealot. I get, excited, as we all do, about our own work. So I wanted to acknowledge that I see myself as firmly rooted in pluralism at each of these tasks of psychopathology, right? I think one thing we can say for certain is that mental disorders appear to be very complex. And so there are going to be multiple ways to think about them, multiple ways to classify them, multiple ways to study and explain them, and of course, multiple ways to treat them. And it might just be something like building this house here, where we are going to need different tools for different kinds of tasks. So what I'm presenting today is one way of thinking about mental disorder that I think can be useful and offer us insight. A little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be doing. I'm just going to present some background on 3E cognition or enactivism more broadly. And if you, Chris's prior talk on this topic offers a much broader overview and a really awesome overview of that area, I'm going to keep it necessarily brief today. I'm then going to jump into presenting what I think mental disorder looks like from when we're grounded in this worldview. And even at that level, I think, as might come up in question time, there are likely multiple ways to think about mental disorder within this worldview. I'm going to look at mental disorder, what I think it looks like in a structural sense, like in terms of its causal structure, what is it, where is it, and as part of that, review 2 existing ways to look at mental disorder structurally, and then move to the normative domain, why, what counts as mental disorder and why. And there's quite a few existing models there I think are worth having a look at. And then I'll try to stitch things together right at the end into a sort of, how to make a complete concept. I downed too much coffee before this. Okay, so 3 cognition. For anyone in the know, you might be wondering, hey, where's extension? Often we're referring to 4E cognition, and I might get to that, but my main focus is on embodiment, embedment, and enactivism. So starting with the concept of embodiment, very roughly, look, brains are really important. Would be silly to deny that, but we're not just brains driving around a skeleton like a car, right? The mind is not a separate thing to the body. It's something physical, and it's happening all the way down. So this sort of view is reasonably opposed to software metaphors and ideas of representation. And with this view, cognition is often seen as dispersed across the body. There are some great examples in Thompson, 2007 there, and they take quite a while to unpack. I did think I wanted to acknowledge how this can sound very simple on paper, right? It's a non-Cartesian sort of view where the mind is as the body does over time. But it changes things quite drastically. Just yesterday, I had a client not turn up, and so I took the opportunity to be doing a little bit of, I was browsing some videos on YouTube about central sensitization syndromes. And I was watching this great video, I was agreeing with a lot of it. It was quite interesting. He was talking about the different mechanisms from the more peripheral, situated more peripherally in the nervous system, up through the nervous system and into the brain, through which we can see upregulation and sensitization of various senses, and particularly pain, and is finding it really interesting. And he gets to the point. He gets at one point. He says, "I'm going to pause here, and I want to ask which parts of this model do you think are psychological?" To which I immediately responded under my breath, well, every single bit of it. And immediately afterwards, he said none of it. And he was trying very much to remove any sense of blame from these complex syndromes and presentations that people can have. And I do get that, but I found that very frustrating. And it was just, I thought it was an interesting example of how radically this can change our perspective. What is psychological can't simply be that which we can't explain mechanistically, or can't, we can't see in the brain, because as we come to understand how the mind is embodied, on that view, what is mental is going to shrink away. Anyway, if I keep talking that much, we'll never get there. So next, the concept of embedment. This is the idea that, hey, we're placed in a physical and sociocultural environment since before we're born, that interactions with this environment over time are necessary for our development and survival, and it shapes us as we shape it in turn. And the recognition that much of our cognition is achieved using the environment. This is where we can see overlap with the concept of extension. Extension is the idea that we should best understand cognition, or the mind, as spread out across the environment. I think that brings a little bit too much metaphysical baggage, pardon me. And so I just stick to this concept of deeply, richly embedded bidirectional causal relationships, strongly influencing the mind in its development over time. What this means is that in order to get a full picture and truly understand human behavior, thought, emotionality, we have to consider the whole brain-body environment system as it evolves over time. Finally, enactivism. this is a hugely broad set of ideas, and it, to be honest, sort of subsumes ideas of embodiment and embedment. Two of the core ideas within this sort of umbrella term, one is that mind is a verb, not a noun. It's something that we do, and the mind is geared for action. And a second idea is, or related idea, is that mindedness, our quality of having a mind, is enacted through and deeply connected to our organizational structure, that there is, as not just as humans, but as life forms. And this is referred to as the deep continuity thesis. This is something that I'm particularly interested in because I think there is an inherent natural normativity within enactivism. So what I mean by this is that I can meaningfully say that this that fire, if I have a match and I hold it up to this tree, perhaps I can meaningfully say that this is bad for this tree in a way that I can't say about these rocks. So reasonably simple example, unpacking that a little bit more and how we can maybe understand that difference we can see. I want to start with the fact that it's easy for life forms to die, right? We are precarious beings, and as a simple result of the entropic state of the universe, it's really easy for us to die. If we stop actively maintaining ourselves, we dissipate and rot and spread out across our environment. As such, we're constantly having to use energy to maintain ourselves. We have a constant metabolism. This makes us really different from the rest of the world as life forms because we have an embedded purposiveness, would be one way to phrase it. We're shaped to strive and keep trying to maintain and stay alive. And as such, much like this tree and this rock, things can be good or bad with this purpose, and this includes the behaviors that we engage in. So as such, we can kind of operationalize this normativity as functional norms, that things can be good or bad for life forms in general. And that's sitting at the heart of enactivism, and I think it's a core part of what's useful about it. For those with I see this as sort of within biology, I guess. I see this as a little bit of a bridge across that sort of Humean divide between an ought and an is, that we see through ideas of organizational causality, the emergence of a way to start talking about norms and what ought to be rather than simply what is. So pulling this together in terms of what 3E cognition can offer for an understanding of mental disorder, it's giving us a really comprehensive view of human functioning. It necessitates consideration of brain, body, and environment, that brain, body, environment system idea. And this environment is both physical and sociocultural. This is, I want to flag here that this is subtly different to biopsychosocial holism because it places all of these different domains or factors across these different areas into one single ontological space, into this model of the organism standing in relation to the world, or this brain, body, environment system. Oase and myself have a paper coming up soon where we discuss this. I believe he gave a previous talk in this series as well. So this view, as a result, is both deeply non-reductionistic in the sense that reductionism solely can't be the only answer, and very naturalistic. It's open to a wide variety of investigatory methods. And again, within enactivism, there's that naturalistic account of normativity and a view of people as purposive agents. So getting on to what I think mental disorder might look like from this perspective on human functioning. And again, I want to start with the structural conception. What and where is mental disorder? Also, I'm going to be assuming realism just for the interest of time. So in terms of previous views, obviously we have an essentialist type view where mental disorders are clearly demarcated in nature. They have a defined core or underlying cause. We can see this clearly with biological views, such as the serotonin theory of depression, but also I think there is a way we can understand psychological essentialist views, things like cognitive biases being if we view that as the core of mental disorder, or Freudian neuroses, say, where that's the root of what it means, or what ultimately causes mental disorder, and that we can see a sort of essentialist bent to such views. Alternatively, and with growing popularity, we have this idea of mechanistic property clusters. This is where mental disorders emerge as recurring, similar enough sort of entities, due to the relationship, not to some underlying cause necessarily, but to the relationship between different factors. So for example, I am having difficulty sleeping because of all the coffee that I've been drinking, and that disrupts my, to get it started, and that disrupts my mood throughout the day. I start getting a little bit anxious. Then over the next couple of nights, I can't sleep because I've got these worries running through my head. That disrupts my sleep further, and so on. We've got a little bit of a loop there, and then I pick up along the way until they're all reinforcing each other. Though I note there that I'm falling back on a sort of symptom level view. This is related to the idea of the symptom network modeling, which does relate to this mechanistic property cluster view, but it's not tied necessarily just to a symptomatic level. We might also be talking about neurotransmitters and structural racism and various other components and how they can fall together to hold a pattern in place. Also acknowledging there that this network can be more or less diffuse. So I said it's not necessarily tied to the idea that there are no underlying causes. Some of those views within that network, some of those factors within that network rather, can still be dominant on this sort of view. This was put forward by Kendler, and Craver, well, at least as applied to mental disorder in 2011. So what I think mental disorder looks like from a 3E view, I think it's very similar to this mechanistic property cluster view. It's a little bit more explicit about the fact that it's multi-scale across the brain-body environment system. We're going to see a variety of factors that are going to influence behavior broadly constrained, including thought and emotion. So effectively, and I'm using the term scale there in preference to a term like level. I just don't want to reify these traditional different levels that we sort of split things up into, acknowledging the fact that these are all in a similar space, and these are just different scales of time and space. So yeah, very similar to this MPC view, where factors form a relatively stable dynamic pattern within the brain-body environment system. I've referred to this view as a sort of sticky tendency. We fall into a state and we get stuck by the reafferent pattern of these various factors interacting with each other. Pardon me. And if we look at this sort of dynamically, that's what I'm trying to represent there, that we can fall into a particular state that we find it harder to move out from. Slightly different to that MPC view. We'll get to that later when I try to pull the structural and the normative together a bit. So moving on to sort of the normative conception of mental disorder. What I mean by this is what counts as disorder, and we're looking at 4 previous answers. Whoop, I'm having a bit of... Along the way, I'm going to use a really corny example of Neddy the nerd to help me out with that. So when we first think of what might count as mental disorder, often we think about, well, what's statistically abnormal? So for example, see Neddy here, he is abnormally socially anxious. He has a real hard time talking to his peers. And so that's perhaps what makes him disordered in some way. This quickly falls down, though, because abnormality itself doesn't get us very far. Neddy could perhaps also be abnormally good at maths. And that doesn't sound like a mental disorder. So one set of views that do try to make this work can be labeled statistical functionalism, proposed primarily by Christopher Nielsen. And this is the view that what is disordered is that deviates from people of a similar age and sex to you and gets in the way of important functions. So that would be a way of starting to separate, being abnormally good at maths versus abnormally socially anxious. But on what basis do we count things as important functions is a big question here. And also what counts as, why do we compare to people of a similar age and sex? Sometimes ethnicity is thrown in there, but why are those factors prioritized? And that's left somewhat unjustified. A second approach to defining what is mentally disordered, well, perhaps it's something to do with what is evolutionarily abnormal. This can be seen in Jerome Wakefield's famous account. This is not all of it. I'm just talking about the dysfunction component here. His view, for those of you who aren't aware of it, is this idea that disorder is a dysfunction as defined by an evolutionary abnormality, something that's not performing a natural function as it should, and which causes harm, defined in a sort of more socially culturally informed way. So it's kind of this two-part system. But his idea of dysfunction itself is grounded in this evolutionary view. So coming back to Neddy, perhaps, he just likes to sit and read his book all day. But humans are really socially involved creatures, right? That's part of what it means for us to be human. We've clearly evolved in this way. And he doesn't really fit with that picture. So perhaps there's something a bit odd about Neddy. Perhaps we could start labeling this aspect of his behavior as disordered in some way. But we can see several issues here. How do we know that we have this evolutionary story correct? I think a big issue here is, does evolution really provide the notion of design? It's a lot more contingent than that, and messy and ongoing, and variance and difference plays such a core role in the evolutionary engine that can we really say that deviation from that is necessarily bad in and of itself? I feel like that's on sketchy ground. And a kind of practical concern of maybe we're just making up these evolutionary stories to fit with our value judgments, right? So perhaps we actually, in trying to label Neddy as disordered because he likes to sit in the corner and read too much, perhaps we're really just labeling him as disordered because that's not what we like in society. This example works a lot better in New Zealand when I can say, well, Neddy's not going to grow up to be a rugby player. But the concern there is maybe we're just going to make up a just so story in a way to justify our social judgment or our value judgment. This leads us to a third way to demarcate the disordered from the benign, which is perhaps it just really does have something to do with value and what society doesn't vibe with. So this is a position referred, proponents of which are referred to as the evaluativists. They're those that accept that disorder is in part decided by society, that when we diagnose people, there is a sense in which we're evaluating them. There's a huge variety of views under this label. So we could look at a Foucauldian type view where disorder is simply a mode of social control and punishment for those that deviate from the norm or that which we value. Or we have authors such as Fulford Sadler Steer, who just point out the almost undeniable fact that, hey, values seem to be playing a pretty clear role. You know, even just the fact that we're saying this, look, this isn't working and this is, there appears to be a degree of value judgment there that we can't escape from. It's also playing a role in Wakefield's view, which I flagged before. So that dysfunction component defined naturalistically, but it's also got to be harmful, as defined by sort of in a socioculturally informed way. One of the most commonly cited concerns with this type of view is cultural relativism, the idea that if somebody is sitting in one culture in which they have a set way, you know, they often issues of psychosis, or what we define as psychosis, are used in this example, where we pluck somebody out of one culture in which they are defined as being psychotic in some way. They're seeing things that aren't there. We place them into another culture that has some structures of meaning present to sort of scaffold such behaviors and understand them in a non-pathologized way, to perhaps understand those experiences as spiritual or having some deeper meaning, and that person therefore has value, and therefore they're scaffolded and supported by society. All of a sudden it seems like less of a problem and more where did the disorder go? So anyway, I'm starting to ramble somewhat, but the idea is that some people have a difficulty with if we're simply defining things on the basis of value and we pluck someone and put them in a different culture, then should we really be able to change what is disordered or not so quickly? Lastly, I wanted to briefly acknowledge pragmatism. It's certainly growing in popularity. This is the mental disorder. Mental disorders are at least partially what we choose to see as mental disorder because it's useful to us in some way. Again, there's quite a range within this view, a sort of more extreme view presented by O'Connor 2017, that mental disorders are practical psychiatric kinds. They are categories that psychiatry invents because they're useful for psychiatry's purpose of helping people. Or alternatively, a view presented by Zacher, which I'm very open to, and he puts it a lot more beautifully than I ever could. Concepts for psychiatric disorders are constituted by discoveries and decisions. There is an interaction between what the world produces and what we find useful to notice. So I'll just check time-wise. Oh, it's getting away on me. So one key division that we can see within these normative views is the divide between objectivism versus evaluativism. On the left here, we have views that see disorder as inherent within nature in some way, and on the right, we see some degree of value judgment, whether it's based on practical decision-making or social values. And Wakefield is one exception to this, right? He's sort of got a leg in each camp, but he's still very much respecting that boundary by having this two-part system. Pulling back to enactivism here, I want to just touch back on that idea of natural normativity, right? We can meaningfully say that something can be bad for this tree in a way that we can't say about a pile of rocks. And I want to recognize that this is a way to begin bridging or collapsing that division between fact and value. So a classic example often used in enactivism is that of a bacterium sitting in its environment. Within this environment, say there is sugar, which are its food source, and some toxins, which can degrade that bacteria in some way. Enactivism recognizes that through what we were talking about before, that natural normativity, it can be useful, or it can be meaningfully said to be good for that bacteria to move towards the sugar and to motivate away from the toxins. And that's exactly what we see through a sort of simple embodied mechanism apparently, I'm no biologist. The point of relevance here is that even at this simple level, or the simple, this is simply really an analogy, right? But we can say that it would be, if that bacteria started moving away from sugar and towards the toxins, I think it would be pretty reasonable to say, hey, that looks dysfunctional in some way. That's not what it's meant to do, and it's acting against its best interest. Of course, we're somewhat more complicated than that. I think it's fair to say. Maybe that's our human hubris, but we're somewhat more complicated than a bacteria sitting in a simple environment such as this, right? Very briefly, I want to say that, hey, I acknowledge this greater complexity, right? How can we think about these much larger structures of meaning and sociocultural levels of meaning that we're situated in? I want to start with the idea that there are some ways in which what's going on is quite similar, right? We are, as biological creatures, still responding to very similar needs, right? We need water, shelter, warmth, food, and so on. And as such, the physical environment places constraints on our behavior. But we're not just placed in a physical environment, we're also situated in a sociocultural environment, which we as a group constitute. And as such, we can see the emergence of more complex sort of interpersonal prudential norms emerging as functional norms within our behavior. Things like being able to maintain emotional stability, to be able to garner community support, to master skills that are going to be useful to us and to those around us. And I also want to acknowledge that these are going to be very different depending on the different sociocultural environments that we find ourselves in and that we are that we develop in. So very loosely, that's how I attempt to acknowledge that greater complexity that we as humans have to deal with in our lives. So pulling together this normative view of what mental disorder looks like under the 3 perspective, well, what I think it looks like under the 3 perspective, the label of disorder appears as an evaluation that someone's behaviors, thoughts, and feelings aren't working for them in reference to their own mode of functioning in the world, and that this mode of functioning is culturally situated and individually crafted across time as a function of their own individual history and development. So a couple of things to note here. The idea of disorder or dysfunction that we're talking about here is not one of a part of a mechanistic part not working, like we see in many medical views of disorder or dysfunction. And as many naturalist positions that we're talking about try to claim is going on in mental disorder, it's also not a sociocultural judgment that a behavior is abnormal or wrong, as the evaluativist position holds. Rather, it's an evaluation that someone is, that someone's behavior that they continue to engage with repetitively and inflexibly is actually acting against their own best interests, and they appear to be stuck. So very briefly, oh yeah, we're doing okay with times. So very briefly, pulling this together, considering the natural and normative together. And I think, sorry, this keeps jumping forward. I also want to point out that I think viewing these traditionally separated domains together is sort of necessary under an enactive view, right, where the normative arises from the natural as per the organizational structures of life forms. Anyway, starting to ramble there. So the central question then of what is mental disorder, this is my best stab answer under an embodied, embedded, and enactive view. mental disorders are dynamic and reafferent patterns that exist spread out across the brain-body environment system that appear to keep people stuck in behaviors that do not ultimately serve their own needs and purposes. This is a causalist view where we can recognize that there are causal structures at play that bear enough similarity across different people. As humans, we have similar brain-body environment systems. There are important differences, especially at a cultural level, but we can recognize perhaps that there are similar patterns that people keep falling into. And so we will be able to demarcate disorders and different kinds of disorders as a function of the similarity of that pattern, much like under the MPC view. It's a view that obviously recognizes internal and external causes, that our everything from our basic biology up, and I recognize that I'm grounding myself there in a sort of hierarchical view. That was a bit of a slip of language. That's sort of frowned upon within an enactive perspective, but everything from our biology out to our sociocultural environment can be shaping and maintaining our behavior. And the same is true for mental disorder under this view. Interestingly, I think this points to a sort of moderately essentialist view. What I mean to say that this is not unconstrained holism, right? This is not, everything is super relevant. Rather, these patterns, we can see similarity across them, right? Maybe not with the concepts that we're currently working with, but with things like melancholic depression, anxiety, and in certain patterns of anxiety in general, perhaps. We can see similar enough patterns that people are falling into, and this gives us it's not the same as saying, hey, there's a underlying cause, but it's not the same as saying that there are no kinds present at all. And similar to that MPC view, I'm importing a lot of the strengths from that, where it's not completely opposed to dominant underlying causes. We may find mechanisms within the brain, say, or mechanisms within our sociocultural environments that appear as dominant causes that maintain these patterns of distress. That's an empirical question, right? And not necessarily one that can be answered at a purely conceptual level. As sort of explored, this is both a natural and a normative view. And I think a strength is that it's strongly agential. It recognizes that these patterns that we fall into emerge very much from the individual's striving to survive. It recognizes that people are often trying their very best to survive and attempting to utilize their ways of coping that they have crafted across their development in a changed environment, say, and that something has changed and is no longer working. Or not necessarily a change in the environment, right? But that something has shifted and they've become stuck in a pattern, and they're finding it difficult to shift that pattern that they're stuck in. But it recognizes that at its core that they are striving. I don't know whether I regret putting this in, but there was a footnote buried in my thesis that I never got to put into the main text. I was trying to pull this fuller conception of mental disorder into a sort of centralized metaphor. It's not perfect, but I think it might be useful, a sort of less technical way of understanding how I view this concept. Essentially, if we understand human behavior and striving and adaptation as a river, right, with the ocean sort of representing the striven for state of adaptation and self-maintenance, then we can see that rivers flow towards that ocean. That's the nature of life, that striving is inherent to life. but within rivers, we can see that, hey, there are very often normal eddies that form, that not all that water is flowing in one direction all the time. That we can eat too much chocolate and we can stay up too late and feel miserable sometimes, and these things aren't necessarily purely functional, but they're part of the way of finding our way to the ocean as we're snaking our way in interaction with the environment that surrounds us to find our way to survive and self-maintain and to flourish within our context. Under this sort of view, mental disorder starts to look like maybe it's a couple of different eddies that start to eat away into the flow of that river, into the bank, and form somewhat of a pool or a lake that starts to risk stagnation. Right, the river, the water still flows to that ocean, but we're starting to risk drastically slowing down. So it's a bit corny, I think, a bit dramatic, but I hope it potentially is useful in terms of a little bit less technically pulling some things together. So I watched a video recently about how to give good presentations, and it said you should always finish up with a list of contributions. That didn't really work for me, so I decided I'd instead want to acknowledge the things that I didn't get to talk about today. I've stuck to the conceptual side of things. I didn't get to cover some of the things that I'm excited about in terms of the implications of this view for the task of explanation. I've got a paper there with my PhD supervisor, Tony Ward, that gives one possible account of explanation of mental disorder. It's focused on the maintenance of disorder, of these patterns over time, and how we might be able to conceptualize and it's a sort of meta-methodological view, right? One idea of what developing explanations of these patterns might look like. I'm also really, something I didn't get to explore in my thesis, but I'm hoping to explore in future work, is starting to move towards treatment, but the role of kind of idiographic, individual level explanation within the treatment process. What I'm talking about there is formulation. I've got some developing ideas about what this view says about what a good formulation should look like and what it should recognize. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that I was talking about my particular perspective today. I didn't get to cover, oh, that just jumped forward. It's almost like it's on a timer. Anyway, that I didn't get to cover some alternative views in this area. Most importantly, Dehaan, who's a major author in this area, in her book, Enactive Psychiatry. I think that should say 21. It came out at the start of this year. Anyway, Michelle Mace also recently presented an article in this area presenting her own view. And I think that was in, not review, but it was waiting for publication for quite some time. So I think it's actually been in the books for a while. I do have a recent paper in PPP that compares my own views to Dehaan, if you're interested in seeing what. Yeah, that's what I wanted to cover today, and I hope there's something of interest there for you. I'm keen to hear what kind of questions you guys might have.
Dr. Nielsen, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. That was a really helpful and clear and concise kind of overview. I have lots of questions, but I'd like to.
Thank you.
I'd like to.
Glad I managed to stick roughly to time.
Yes, you did. Yes. Thank you. I mean, I have plenty of questions, but I'd like to open it up to the rest of the folks first of all. Ian, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I thought that was brilliant. Yeah, thanks. But when you say striving to survive, do you mean the individual, or do you mean the as a biological, as a species? Because when you start to talk about evolution, of course, evolutionary theory says it's not necessarily about survival; it's about reproduction. So you can, once you've reproduced, then maybe you're off the hook. You don't have to survive anymore. You've done your evolutionary task, and I think that comes into a lot of different conceptions. I mean, we had Professor Kendall, once a psychiatric professor in Scotland, now deceased, but his inaugural lecture in Edinburgh tried to think of that issue of how do we define mental disorder. And he seized on things like reproduction. So famously pilloried in the Scottish press for saying, yeah, homosexuality should be a mental disorder because there's a lack of reproduction, and he was shot down in flames. And he would have alcoholism in there because he thought that impaired reproduction, whether empirically it does. But when you try and look for those, so he was going for ability to reproduce, lifespan. So compared to the average, if you had a cluster of things, that equals schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, maybe you don't live as long. And certainly, despite modern treatment, I don't think we have extended the average lifespan for people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They're still, the end result can be suicide and premature death. So this sort of search for. So anyway, back to the question: Did you mean the individual striving to survive, or did you mean some kind of force about evolutionary survival?
Okay, I was certainly more focused, and I justified through that route of enactivism and the sort of organizational structure of an individual life form, more focused on the striving of the individual. I think that there's those evolutionary views that you're talking about. They offer really interesting insight, but the homosexuality example is one clear instance where we can see that something's going wrong there. And I think part of that is that understanding humans as a product of creatures as products of evolution is really interesting. It's can be productive, but it's also only one. It's sort of an impoverished view at the same time, right? It's really fascinating, but our lives are about more than that. So this was more, focused in on the as a basis of our sort of organizational structure as life forms. There's an inherent strive to survive and do what we can while we're here. Part of that may include biological imperatives to try to reproduce, but that's not necessarily always the case, and not necessarily the case for certain individuals. And it's more about striving to survive and generating a meaningful life in the time that we do have while we're here. Yeah.
Because, if I'm allowed, one quick question beyond that: suicide. What other species commit suicide, and why is it so common in humankind to end their own life? Because it cuts across that imperative to strive to survive, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I'll be quiet.
No, that's all good. I think you've keyed in there to one of the key frustrations that I have with this view, is that it doesn't quite, it necessarily almost seems to view suicidality as inherently dysfunctional or in some way. And I think it doesn't make sufficient space for a more compassionate understand, or not a compassionate's the wrong word, because we can still very much understand that process, but it sort of views that as inherently dysfunctional. And I think the only way that I've found around that within this view is to recognize that the same norm of behavior that might lead to an individual harming themselves or ending their life. No, that's not so much the self-harm thing, that's a different issue, but the same norms that may lead to somebody ending their life may support wider individuals within that group, right? I can sacrifice myself for the wider society or cultural group that I'm in, and while that does end my life, and that there's something inherently dysfunctional about that, if we focus in on the individual, if we step back and look at how that same norm of behavior allows has previously supported my flourishing and my survival because somebody else in the past ended their own life, or in order to, I don't know, there's something in there that might allow it, but I think you've keyed in there to one inherent difficulty that I can see with this view, and I think it's important to acknowledge. I think it's part of why we do need multiple perspectives on such a complex issue as mental disorder.
Freud and the decades, and conceptions that Thanatos and Eros are somehow linked, if you go... Anyway, I'm aware Ken's trying to...
No, I found it fascinating. I really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
It's totally new to me. I'm sort of a retired medical sociologist, so all these theories are very new to me. But picking up on Ian's point, that's point that came through to me a bit. I'm obviously a sociologist, so I tend to minimize the individual aspects of things and say it's all to do with society. But it was a feeling of, the individuals, that it does seem to be focused, some of these theories focused on the individual's needs and purposes, and if they weren't getting their needs and purposes, then that was dysfunctional. So I was thinking along the lines of war, where self-sacrifice, people will kill themselves for the group, and that's a higher value. I was also thinking the last presentation, when people were doing the same thing again and again, and it defeated their own purposes, that was dysfunctional. Immediately jumped into my mind Trump. I was thinking somebody that does the same thing again and again in a very egotistical way, and it provides for all his needs and functions. That's obviously someone who is very functional and has got no problems at all. So I think it's this worry of it being too focused on individual elements.
Yeah, I think the Trump example is a great one. It was something that frustrated me with all the flag waving around. Hey, is there something wrong with this guy? And I was sitting there going, well, it's clearly working for him. He's managing to be the president of the United States and live a pretty lavish lifestyle. But anyway, that aside, your earlier point, I think that's key. There is one author, Robert Chapman, who is working in the area of neurodiversity, and he has taken something there's a deep parallel, I think, between his work and what I'm trying to sketch out. But he refers to it, and what I mean by that is that idea that what we're talking about here is functionality. He takes it away from necessarily orienting that just around the individual. He still makes space for individual functionality, but he beautifully talks about how, and I think that it certainly would fit with the embedded aspects of my work. He starts talking about how we can all serve different niches within our communities, and that diversity of skill sets and diversity of approaches is necessary for the continued survival of the wider community, and therefore the individuals within that community. So that makes things a lot more complicated, but I think it can sit alongside what I'm talking about here. And I think that's what I'm was trying to get at when I was trying to work around this difficulty of suicide, because I think there is a sense in which the analysis that I've presented is somewhat individualized. I don't mean that in the sense that it's, early on when I was still figuring out how to talk about this stuff, I kept getting a lot of reviews that were saying, hey, you're talking about autonomy of the individual, and you're talking about agency and survival of an individual. Does this even work for more collectivist cultures? And I think it's still open to that, right? But yeah, I think that we can think about functionality in lots of different ways, and if we stay too focused on the individual and ignore the sociocultural environment in which that functionality is embedded, then we're going to be missing a lot. And we need to be thinking about, that is a cost to that individual, but everything's an equation, right? And if that's a cost to the individual, but it serves the group and in return serves them, then there is a sense in which that behavior is functional. And we can miss that if we focus in on an individual in isolation. But I think that still fits with this view through that idea of rich sociocultural embedment.
Thank you.
Can I chip in there, Chris?
Yeah, Chris.
Just because you may have answered this, but so obviously a key aspect of your theory is kind of collapsing that kind of normative gap. So the value that we place, the values that we're dealing with are emerging naturally. They're both natural and they're normative. And you kind of, so if I'm right, there's a focus on kind of, I think you use the phrase self-maintenance, and I guess I may be a bit worried that we've recognized the problems of it being too individualistic, and the need for those to recognize the value of society and other, the kind of broader cultural aspects. Can we still get those? Can those values still come from a kind of naturalistic origin? Do you see what I mean? Like, can we still keep that that naturalism with regards to values there? And if so, how are we doing that?
That is a really good question. I think yes, we can, because I think it comes back to what's working for that individual and in terms of what's functional for them. So I can still see a route to doing that. What you're also touching on, but in order to do that well, we need to be recognizing that sociocultural embedment, right? But you're also touching there on that recent paper that I mentioned, trying to compare to Sanaga Dahan's view. I feel, and I don't want to speak for her, but my speculation is that she would say no. If we try to naturalize that aspect of human behavior or human value and structures of meaning, we are missing something important. And she starts talking about our existential stance and our ability to reflect on who we are and who we want to be and the kind of lives we want to live. And that gets us there quite quickly. I still think there is utility and, in fact, a weird kind of, I don't know how relevant this is, but I see it as kind of an aesthetic value, a beauty to recognizing that even those higher level structures of meaning that emerge through an understanding the sociocultural view can still have a connection to our survival and our, well, not just our survival, but our flourishing, our adaptation through our history, right? Our cultural history, through the way our ancestors have learnt and developed these structures of meaning to survive and to work together and flourish. So I think we can, I like to understand values in that way. In that way, we're understanding values as serving a function within a society, within a culture, and having developed over time. Because I think that's how we can explain these values in the world. Otherwise, where do values come from? I don't know. Through just simply saying that values emerge from observing ourselves and having an idea of who we want to be, I think it's a bit simple, right? Because where does that preference come from? It comes from from my sociocultural embeddedness, through what I've learned about what a good life is, and so on. And that itself emerges from society or a culture, and that culture itself is also susceptible to those same processes of trying to strive and survive over time. It gets really, it gets complicated, but I think that's a really important point that you're raising there.
Can I just build on that? I don't know if it will build on it a bit, but I was really interested in what you would. I might go away from this talk. Really interesting, but I was thinking perhaps what you're doing is marrying up the idea of property clusters and the 3E conception, and giving a sort of saying that the 3E vision is a single ontology. And perhaps that brings something new to the idea of the property clusters and a sort of biopsychosocial approach to it. But then I would wonder how you, looking at the definition that you give of a mental disorder, and I've tried to write it down, but about the biological the system, the whole system that keeps
brain body environment system.
Brain body environment system that keeps people stuck in behaviors that serve their own needs and purposes. And I was thinking about, a critique of the property cluster thing would be, say, well, why is racism, for example, not a mental disorder? Because it might be a self-reinforcing state of affairs in which people could say, well, actually, it suits. It's in a way that it can systematically keep going. But we wouldn't want to classify it as a mental disorder.
Can I clarify? Do you mean what aspect are you seeing? Like, do you mean at a societal level that racism could be viewed as a sickness of society, or do you mean for the individual who holds?
Yeah, I suppose it's a sort of classificational problem. So, okay, if you have your definition of mental disorder as the basis of a classificatory system, a taxonomy, and it's borrowing a lot, I think, in some respects, from the property cluster model.
Absolutely.
Then, which I'm sympathetic to, but how would a condition such as racism not be regarded as a condition, but as something else? Why? Because it would feel like a big mistake to regard it as a mental disorder. Okay.
Do you mean who would you be diagnosing in this view? Do you mean the individual who's suffering as a result of racism, or the individual who's being racist? I don't know, maybe the next edition of just DSM-6, I suppose. If it was there and people were saying, let's throw this one in. How would we dispose it? How do we say, no, it doesn't belong? Okay. I think I'll break it down into those different sort of cases that I can see, right? For the individual who is expressing racist views, we can still say that that's morally wrong, right? But I can't see how we could view that as mental disorder, because it's serving needs for them, right? When somebody expresses views held by the wider society, even if we can say that they're morally wrong or even abhorrent, that they get social kudos from that, right? By playing into that it's part of their sociocultural mode of functioning world. No. So I don't think that's a problematic case. For the individual who is exposed to unwarranted and unequal constraints on the ways that they can survive and thrive, for the person who is a victim of systemic racism, that's why I think it's important to acknowledge that it's about that individual's survival and ability to flourish. Because if I was applying sort of an extension type view that just expanded out, then it would start getting very murky. But if we tie it to the individual, then we can acknowledge that they're doing their best in an unfair world, in a world that should be different, and that a world that isn't serving their needs as much as it is serving somebody else's needs. And so for that individual, they're not doing anything repetitively against their own functional interests, right? They're just surviving and trying to strive and do the best they can in a world that's treating them unfairly. So I don't see any emergence of disorder on that view. There's a wider question of, can we see this unequal distribution of resources and constraints on people surviving? But I'm not interested in labeling that as a mental disorder. It might, I don't know. There's an interesting question there of whether, I think Awais has asked me this before, about whether this implies that there's a way of viewing a kind of sickness or dysfunction at a societal level. I don't know about that. Possibly. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it's the last bit which I suppose is interesting in a way, about how the I don't know really, but
I don't know either. There's something, when I started talking about how, at the point of the talk when I was talking about how we're a lot more complicated than bacteria and trying to acknowledge our sociocultural embedment, what I was referencing there was a view that I've referred to as the constitutional view of culture, espoused by Fuchs and a few others. And on that view, I think cultures and groups have a purpose of providing for the continued survival of their individual members. And if we can see a kind of purpose emerging at that wider level, then perhaps there is a way of genuinely saying that, hey, if this isn't serving the needs of the individuals within that culture, then there's something wrong here. So, this is very separate to ideas of mental disorder. I'm now talking about that wider worldview. It gets very complicated very quick, but I think that's a really interesting area.
Interesting. Making me think of sluggish schizophrenia in relation to the Soviet system. If you didn't accept the system, then you had this mental disorder. One big question, and I think I had the same question for Lucy Johnston, am I remembering the name right? But why are we trying to explain something called mental illness or mental disorder as if it's a monolith, when actually it's a ragbag of many different things? And I remember having a kind of debate, was it Lucy Johnson, about some of the things we call mental illness represent a discontinuity in that person's personal history and can't readily be explained in terms of, and the case in point is schizophrenia, because I genuinely think that some people, when they develop schizophrenia, it's a total discontinuity. Now, we would say that Alzheimer's disease is a mental disorder or illness, but we wouldn't try to explain it in these psychosocial terms. We see it entirely, and maybe schizophrenia one day will be explained more in biological terms. So I suppose the overarching question there is, why are we trying to sort of one size fits all explanations here? And we just say it's a ragbag, and maybe different explanations for different entities, or
I think that's a really important concern. I've got a couple of points there. So first of all, I don't see this. We've used the term theory a few times. I don't see this as a theory. I don't see it in the sense of, Kenneth, thank you for listening. I don't see this as a theory or an explanation, right? I see this as a conceptualization, and I think it's important to distinguish those things. because, as you're saying, various mental disorders, both in terms of the different kinds of mental disorders we see and in terms of sometimes individual presentations, and perhaps of mental disorder that may emerge for a particular individual, we can't simply sit back, and I can't sit there in my armchair, many stages back and try to explain that. That would be quite ridiculous. What I see myself as doing with this sort of work is providing a conceptual framework for understanding a broader concept of what a mental disorder may or might be, what is and isn't, some ideas of what they tend to look like, so that we can go about our efforts to explore, understand, explain, and treat in a kind of, in a way, in different and interesting ways, and to have a clearer understanding of what we, rather than just assuming, right, like a simple biological psychiatry implicitly, and then letting that guide us. So there's that distinction, and there was something else. You were talking about how the ragbag nature of hey, and it's sort of the pragmatist point, right? Zeka puts this really well, that maybe all these things we call mental disorders, maybe there's not something similar about them in nature, but rather there's something similar about them in terms of what we can do to help. And so we cluster them all together because we have ways of helping, we're developing ways of helping that address all these things, and there's a historical contingency to lumping them all together as well. I fully acknowledge that. I think this analysis of the concept of mental disorder is going to apply to some mental disorders more than others. I think this fits really well with depression. It fits really well with anxiety. It fits really well with quite a few of what I see as sort of core things, but it doesn't necessarily fit as well, potentially, with schizophrenia or Alzheimer's, because there is potentially, and this is somewhat of an empirical question, something more essentialist going on in the brain. But analyzing those types of disorders, these more towards the organic end of the continuum, I think will still be fruitful if we analyze them through this embodied, embedded, and active lens, because even though the ultimate, or the dominant rather of those things may be somewhere in the brain, they're still going to be responsive to those more embedded or psychological factors. And so understanding them that way is still going to reveal a network of causes, right? There will be there are more dominant causes in the middle, but there's still going to be, it's still going to allow ways of helping. If we can't take away that central cause of some of these problems, there's still going to be ways of making those people easier or more functional when we understand them in this sort of network way.
I was thinking, I kind of love the history of medicine, and for the first time tonight, I'm sort of thinking, we go back to Hippocrates, or, the four humors or something, and is this discussion of mental illness like, people in the 18th and 19th century, well, more the 18th century, would have a system of medicine. Cullen, Scottish physician, would explain the doctrine of the nerves or something, trying to explain every physical illness, gout and pneumonia and so on. So I was wondering, is this the equivalent of that? We're a couple of centuries behind, although I'm not really buying into the neurophilosophy. What's the Lady Churchland's idea? We don't know enough about the brain, but once we do know enough about the brain, then we'll be able to differentiate mental illnesses and understand them better. And if half the human genome is for the brain, we've only scratched, but no, I really enjoyed it tonight, and that whole thinking about it historically as well is intriguing for me.
Thank you.
I'm aware
I've really enjoyed being able to present.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm aware we're starting to run out of, well, we have run out of time, but could I just ask one question? I guess really just to give, you alluded to the fact that there was kind of what do you see as kind of the future of this, in terms of what are the implications in terms of I guess, yeah, further explanatory frameworks and kind of beyond that, I guess if you could just give us a wee hint as to some of the things that that are happening, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to be working as a clinician this year, and it's been really interesting having this in the back of my mind, and also having to meet the everyday, day-to-day needs of responding to what we're required to do, and the people that I'm working with in front of me. And what it sort of made me think about was, a lot of the time I can see how people have constructed ways of coping, like we all have, right, and ways of living their life, and it's often, so I think what it and something has often changed that's resulting in something not working, but that's not always true, right? So very loosely, what I think this is pointing towards in terms of the implications for maybe not treatment as a whole, I think that's a wider question, but a formulation process of an individual's problems, and I guess the process of assessment, is to look at what we're seeing through multiple different, there's still going to be a role for a diagnostic sort of process where we go, hey, other people have seen these patterns. I think we can condense that down into different sort of different constellations of different phenomena we're seeing, and what are the potential relationships there. And maybe if we had an evidence base that focused in on how those things hang together, then we might have a more direct link between what we're seeing in front of us and the research base behind us. I think it also pushes us to consider, so a sort of, yeah, that more traditional lens. It pushes us to consider a kind of maintenance type view. I haven't thought about this in a while, sorry. But I think I'm missing something there. But the other thing, what I've been noticing in terms of working with people is this more, that's what it was. So we've got this diagnostic view. Another lens would be, how is this not working for the person, right? How are they getting stuck, right? That sort of falls directly out of this view. But I think what it also pushes us to look at is a kind of developmental view of, how is this, or how has it historically worked for the person? How is there a sense in which it actually forms part of their mode of functioning and being in the world, that they have learnt from their culture around them and individually crafted on the basis of their particular history? And is there a sense in which it's still performing a certain need? And that's where we start seeing it produces this continuous view between what traditionally would have been the different axes in the DSM, right, where we can see there's a bunch of different factors, but actually we might be able to also look at that at the same time and say, we can see how these particular personality factors have developed. And anyway, so I think there's something in that, in terms of looking at individual presentations through multiple lenses of analysis within a single formulation. I think it points us that way, because this, and that connects more broadly to the connections I can see between this kind of worldview and the necessity of pluralism, both when working with individuals and when studying mental disorders more generally.
Thank you so much.
That's right. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. It's been really cool.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.